like to call to order the meeting of September 29th, 2009 of the Ordinance Committee of the City Council to order. We have a staff report from last time that we'll go through briefly, simply because I see a lot of new faces that weren't here last time, but we'll try to make it go as quickly as possible because we do have definitely a lot of speaker cards for public comment. And I'll start with, after the staff report, I'll start with public comment of the three folks that were not able to speak last time, if they are in attendance, and then we'll go to people who have signed up for this time. Mr. Cotto.
Thank you, Chair Williams and members of the Ordinance Committee. I'll just rip through this. It's the same exact presentation as you saw last time. So we're here to talk about the Medical Cannabis Dispensary Ordinance potential revisions. So we're here to review it, discuss options, and then direct us, staff, on what the potential revisions could be. A little bit of history. August 14th, 2007, Council directed staff to come up with an interim ordinance, which was adopted October 3rd, and March 25th, 2008, the city adopted the current ordinance, and it became effective April 24th, 2008, and then July 28th of this year, the Council directed the Ordinance Committee to look at revisions. The current ordinance has locational restrictions and operational restrictions, and the request is heard by the hearing officer. It's appealable to the Planning Commission, but not to Council. Locational restrictions currently allowed in the C2 and CM zones, Outer State Street, Milpas, and on Cliff Drive, the Mesa. They are prohibited within 500 feet of schools, K through 12, parks, and other dispensaries, and prohibited on State Street from Highway 101 to Arriaga. This is a couple of maps. This is a citywide map that shows the areas where they're allowed. This is the downtown area. The pink is where they're allowed. The brown is the State Street Prohibition area. Green are parks. Blue are schools. The light blue around. And I apologize. I wasn't planning to make this presentation. I changed these maps that are on the website so everything's a little bit more viewable. But the light blue around the schools are the 500 foot. The light green around the parks are the 500 foot prohibition around theirs. We have some pending dispensaries, some non-conforming dispensaries, and over here a couple of approved dispensaries. Oops. Milpa Street, again, the allowed area, a couple of approved dispensaries on the radii. Upper State Street, again, the allowed areas. Mackenzie Park takes over an area of around there, and Peabody School. The Mesa. This is the Mesa Shopping Center here with Meg's and Cliff. This is what the current ordinance allows. There are a number of operational restrictions ranging from background checks, minor size and access, display of permits. I'm not going to go through all of them. Current review process, like I said, is heard to staff hearing officer, appealable to the Planning Commission, not to City Council. The approval is valid indefinitely as long as it's the same owner and same location. There is the ability to revoke the permit if they are not complying. There are a number of pending approved projects. This has changed a little bit since the last time. 331 North Milpas is approved and operating. 500 North Milpas is approved, as is 631 Olive. 2 West Mission has now been suspended by the Planning Commission. It was approved by the staff hearing officer. And pending, we have 741 Chapala, 234 East Haley, 302 Haley, 826 Delavina, and 430 Chapala. Now, there are some non-conforming dispensaries. Non-conforming means they were in operation before the adoption, actually before that first date, August 14, 2007, and were found to be operating illegal under the interim ordinance. There's only 4 of these: 3516 State, 27 Parker, 100 East Haley, 3128 State. These top 3 we are investigating. We're not absolutely sure that they still conform. They have conformed to all the requirements to continue to be non-conforming. And there are several that are illegal or under dispute, and others being investigated. We have 14 areas of discussion ranging from, actually I'm going to skip some of the police department statistics, cap on the number of dispensaries, security requirements, Milpas recovery zone, proximity to schools and parks, reducing the amortization period for nonconforming dispensaries. I'm going to skip impact to neighborhood, but reestablishing an interim ordinance and applicability and how that and these whatever comes out of these discussions would be applicable to existing and pending dispensaries, neighboring jurisdictions and how they treat them, criteria for issuance, amount of discretion given to the staff hearing officer, lack of appeal to city council, and allowing dispensaries in different areas than they're allowed now, and then full cost recovery for application processing. I'm skipping this one, and these ones. So should there be a cap? Should it be citywide? Should it be by geographic neighborhood? We have split the city into downtown, Milpas, Upper State, Mesa. There's at least one other proposal for splitting the city, and there's multiple ways to do this. Like I said, the current ordinance has a number of security requirements. Staff was recommending that we add 2 more hours of operation, limited 10 a.m. to 7 p.m., and a licensed security guard from a state licensed security guard. Not just a guy with a T-shirt that says security, someone who knows what they're doing. The Milpas Recovery Zone is a proposal that's going around to limit, I think it's right now to limit alcohol, places that sell alcohol within a certain radius or of the Casa Esperanza. Suggested boundaries are listed above: Milpas, the Beach, Garden, and Gutierrez. There is a proposal to, option is to limit dispensaries in this area too. That would cut out a good part of Milpas Street below Gutierrez. Proximity to schools, right now it's 500 feet from schools and parks. That could be increased. There could be a prohibition within a certain distance of residential zones. I think you just got a letter from the Housing Authority. I just got it this morning that said maybe 500 feet from residential zones. You could include the types of uses that radius is drawn around to include preschools, daycares, drug and alcohol rehab, any number of different uses. Girls Inc. was one that came up last time. Safe routes to school, things like that. The consequence is that you could limit or simply, you could limit or severely limit or even just completely ban them from a location perspective if you did some or all of these. So, for example, and again, I apologize for the colors on this. This is the existing downtown with 500-foot radius from schools and parks. And so you can see there's quite a bit of pink area around, right? If you go to 1,000 feet, that gets reduced down quite a bit. And obviously, if you go, so kind of going back and forth, 500, 1,000, 500, 1,000. So, and then if you go even bigger, if you go a quarter mile, it gets bigger. I have other slides later if you want to see them, but going to that would make it even more. There is an amortization period built into the current ordinance. It was 3 years from the effective date, and that would be April 24th, 2011. There are some options for the council. It could reduce that amount, or it could not change it. I'm just going to skip that one. So then there is an option for a moratorium or an interim ordinance. And that would be, a moratorium would be, it doesn't require any public notice, but it can only hold for 45 days. And then when that 45 days, or if we wanted to continue that sort of thing, we'd have to adopt an interim ordinance. And that would be good for 12 to 18 months. And then that would give time to go through this process. But there are some questions. Actually, this is one of the key things that we would like to get some direction on this hearing, if possible, because there's a lot of pending projects, and depending on how this goes, these could go through a process and have retroactive location requirements, and suddenly they wouldn't be allowed anymore, and where would that become applicable? If a project's already in, it's been deemed complete, it has an approval, or it's got a building permit, or none of those things, and if it chooses to be none of those things, then everybody's at risk right now who's in the process or thinking of coming into the process, because we don't know what these regulations are going to do. Moratorium might be a good idea, or an interim ordinance. Neighboring jurisdictions, right now, as far as our research has told us, only the city and county allow them. All the other jurisdictions either have an outright ban, or they have temporary moratorium or interim ordinances while they decide what they're trying to do. There's some criteria that we want to change or revise. And we want to get some input from the Ordinance Committee on how much discretion the staff hearing officer has on some of these. There are two findings or criteria for issuance that allow some discretion, but the way this is sort of set up is that if you meet these, it was sort of set up purposely with not a whole lot of discretion. If you meet all these regulations, then you sort of get it. Currently, the Planning Commission decision is final on appeal. That has caused quite a bit of angst in the community and on the Planning Commission. The options are to change that to make Planning Commission or City Council the final body, or don't change it. One of the things that came up is that, wow, we're concentrating these into these neighborhoods, and why don't we allow them in other places? For example, why don't we allow them where medical offices are allowed? So we thought, well, maybe the CO zone around Cottage Hospital could be appropriate. There have to be some changes to the operational requirements, because right now they're required to be in a storefront, and if most of the offices and things around Cottage Hospital would actually be offices, then there wouldn't be no storefront. So that would necessitate a change. And we looked around the city, and we thought, well, if we're trying to reduce concentration in these areas, where else could we possibly allow them? And we looked at the CO zone, which is basically all of Coast Village Road that's in the city, and that's a possibility if you want to discuss that. And then full cost recovery, right now we charge $200 an hour for processing, and we need a fee study to find out what full cost recovery really is. We think it's more than $200 an hour. And then appeals, right now the appellant pays the $300 fee, whether it's the neighbor or the applicant, and should the applicant pay for the time that it takes to process that appeal? Interesting question. So we're here to hear public testimony, to review the current ordinance, discuss proposed revisions, and direct staff to make revisions. Like I said, this is old, but after this, I don't know, we could come back here again if we need to, or back to City Council. We will need to go to Planning Commission at some point. The state law requires Planning Commission recommendation to Council, and then Council for introduction and adoption. Oh, this is the new one. So I just posted a whole bunch of maps that show various radii from schools and parks, and showing prohibitions in El Pueblo Viejo or within 500 feet of residential zones and that sort of thing. That's on the map. That's on the website. We got a number of documents last time, which I put up on the website. The citizen ordinance, some white papers that we got, stuff like that. And also, if you want to be on the email list to be notified of future, if anyone out there in the world wants to be notified of these in the future, my email is dkato@santabarbaraca.gov. I will add you to the list. That's the end of my presentation. And so we hope to get some good comments from the Ordinance Committee this time. Thanks.
What Mr. Cotto is speaking to is the fact that we did not, we had so many public speakers last time that I did not allow the committee members to speak because we wanted to get through all of the public speakers. I think we can't necessarily continue doing that, because we definitely can't get anything done in terms of changes to the ordinance without any discussion in the actual ordinance committee. That being said, we have a large stack of speakers, which is why we started this hearing very early today. So maybe we could start with questions from the committee members, and then we will go to public comment. Are there any questions from the committee members? Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question for Mr. Wiley. Could you describe for us what is actually envisioned under Proposition 215? What are these places supposed to be according to 215?
Councilmember Francisco, that's a good question because there's actually recently been some court decisions involving this point. And I think about a year ago, the State Attorney General's office issued some guidelines for medical marijuana dispensaries. And these court decisions have really dealt with those guidelines as somewhat substantive requirements for compliance with Proposition 215. And I think you know that let's see, Proposition 215 was actually, about 10 years ago, more than maybe 10 years ago. And then the state legislature adopted implementing legislation really dealing with the details of how a physician can recommend the use of medical marijuana, and then how a person can obtain medical marijuana. Fundamentally, I think the answer to your question is that these are supposed to be relationships between a medical marijuana patient and a qualified caregiver. And if you look at the state implementing legislation, they don't actually even use the word dispensary. They certainly don't talk about storefront locations. They do talk about people joining together in a cooperative situation, the patients and the qualified caregivers. The law is clear, for example, that qualified caregivers can cultivate marijuana, a certain amount, limited amount of marijuana, and can provide that cultivated marijuana to a patient of theirs. And this doesn't have to be a one-to-one relationship. You can actually be a qualified caregiver for more than one individual. And again, I'm more referring to the state attorney general guidelines. But I think what we're, this whole area has been evolving. And one of the things we're seeing is that some law enforcement authorities are not comfortable with this storefront dispensary concept, and are really insisting on observing the Attorney General guidelines of this cooperative relationship, a not-for-profit relationship, where the law is clear that a qualified caregiver can recoup their expenses for cultivating and providing marijuana, but really is not supposed to be making a profit. So I hope that's responsive to you.
That's good. Yes, thank you.
Mr. House.
Okay, Mr. Cato, on the if you go back to the slide about the non-conforming and illegal dispensaries, I just wanted to settle something for myself. There's it appears that there's a few here that my question is, didn't they have to be in operation for a continuous period of time and not be closed more than 30 days or something? And how do these fit into that requirement?
Chair Williams, Ordinance Committee Member House, yes, that is correct. In order to continue to be non-conforming, it had to be open. You couldn't be closed for more than 30 days. Now, the first three, Horta Farm, Sacred Mountain, and AMG, those, I said that those are under investigation, and those are under investigation because we are not certain that they were open that whole time. So, so those are under zoning enforcement cases that we have. We have had information from the Santa Barbara Patients Group that the city attorney's office did look at and said yes, that was determined to be continuous to be non-conforming. But the top three still are. We're waiting for some information and we're going back and forth with that.
Okay, and when do you think we'll know on those? I mean, like a long time from now, 6 months, or is it going to be in the next few weeks?
I would say, yeah, in the next few to a month or so.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I have one question. The ones that are permitted under the new ordinance, how many have been permitted and how many are actually open?
Chair House, there's only one that's permitted and open, and that's at 331 North Milpas at the top of the list. 500 North Milpas was approved by the staff hearing officer and appealed to Planning Commission. The Planning Commission approved that. So once they go through the process of getting a building permit and any design review for exterior changes, they could open. Same for Greenlight Dispensary at 631 Olive. That was approved by the Planning Commission on appeal.
So thus far, our experience is entirely with dispensaries that were opened up before we made our ordinance regulating dispensaries.
Yes. Well, I mean, we do have I think we have a little bit of experience with 331 North Milpas, as Captain Martell said last time. I think they had one call for service from that dispensary, someone who wouldn't leave, so they called the police to get them to leave. But of the approved ones, yes, you're right. And then all the rest have been either illegal or non-conforming.
And how much time do the non-conforming ones have to either go out of business or change locations, which is what they would need to do for the most part, and go through the approval process to become regulated dispensaries under our ordinance? How much time do they have left?
About 19 months. And Chair Williams, just so you know, for the non-conforming ones, Horta Farm is in a location that meets the current locational requirements. Sacred Mountain is not, although they're 500 feet from the Moreton Bay Fig Tree Park, which is across the freeway. It's a little bit not quite the intention. AMG is within 100 feet of Veracruz Park, so they could not continue in that location. And Santa Barbara Patients Group is within 500 feet of Mackenzie Park, and they would not be able to continue in their location.
And could we, I guess this is a question for Mr. Wiley, could we shorten the amount of time, as what you're calling amortization? Could we shorten the amount of time that we give non-conforming dispensaries to become regulated and have the security requirements and have all these things that we have prescribed in the previous ordinance?
Mr. Chair, I think we could. The concept of pre-existing non-conforming uses is, of course, a long-standing zoning concept, and the law in this area does allow a city to change its regulations and say, and if you are not now legal, at some point in the future you have to become legal or stop operating at that location. And but there is sort of an equity requirement here that the law imposes, and so that's the amortization period. And in fairness, the law says you can't make it too short, but it does depend on the circumstances. For example, if someone comes in and actually builds a development that maybe requires a conditional use permit, and they have a tremendous investment, the courts are probably not going to support a real short amortization period, as opposed to a tenant use, a business use that may be a tenancy with a fairly minor investment. So the law recognizes you can have shorter amortization periods for tenant business uses, and that's what we've done. This was originally a 3-year amortization period. That's about the bottom end of amortization periods you typically see, but I can't say for a fact that 2.5 years would be illegal or improper or anything like that.
So we could potentially shorten that to 6 additional months or 5 additional months, and you think that we would be relatively safe from litigation for that?
I believe so, particularly since we would allow, presumably, a business to move to another location. But some of it, someone may come in and say, you know, I signed a 5-year lease based on a city ordinance, and it's not really fair to force me to cancel that 5-year lease, or a landlord might say that, because you've changed the rules. So I would be somewhat inclined to recommend that if we shorten it, we not make it shorter than 1 year from the date of the decision, that we give them at least a year to...
But these are the locations that we are getting the most complaints and issues from, just by virtue of the fact that they're the ones that are open and unregulated.
Chair Williams, I'm not sure that I could say that. There are a number of illegal ones in the city which I have not put up because they're still under investigation, and so it's probably a combination. I would say it's probably a little bit more the illegal ones than the non-conforming ones. And I would like to point out that the ordinance does require that the non-conforming dispensaries comply with all the operational requirements. They obviously can't all comply with the locational requirements, but the operational requirements, it does require them to comply.
And you don't, given that there's 3 types of dispensaries, you don't need direction on what to do with the illegal or under dispute, because that's something for both the police department and for your zoning enforcement team to work on.
Correct.
But you do need discretion on what to do with the non-conforming and what to do with the ones that are now coming in to be approved, the new dispensaries.
Yes, that's correct. In terms of how these regulations might apply to properties that are pending or approved even, and non-conforming.
And then we might depending on what we do, we might create a fourth category, which is new non-conforming, based on if we create further restrictions that one of the ones that was just approved comes in under.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And then the question is how long to give them to come into conformance. Okay. Any other questions before we go to public comment? So we have a time limit on public comment. I typically give 2 minutes. If we do give 2 minutes, we are unlikely to, if each of you takes 2 minutes, we are unlikely to get anything done. So I want you to say your piece. I don't want you to, not talk, but I do want us to potentially have time to take some actions today. And I would especially hope that your comments could differentiate a little bit between what to do about illegal, non-conforming, and new dispensaries that have just been permitted, and future dispensaries that could be permitted, because there are potentially different things that could be done with each one. So we're going to start with Bonnie Raisin, because she was one of the folks who did not get a chance to speak last time, and will be followed up by Ken Rivas, who also did not get to speak last time.
And I'm concerned about the ambiguity of Prop 15, and I am also concerned about the Attorney General's ambiguity. I believe I think that a qualified caregiver, quote unquote, is very vague as well. I don't understand why physicians cannot prescribe marijuana and have marijuana dispensed through a pharmacy or other such approved facility. I'm also concerned because I heard I think it was the end of July, that there are 15 illegal marijuana dispensaries operating. In my view, there should be no illegal dispensaries. I don't like the word illegal. It bothers me a lot. I was under the impression that we had 3 approved dispensaries, and now I'm seeing that there are 4. If Oakland has such a huge population and has 4, why does Santa Barbara need 4? I believe it is a gateway drug. Marijuana is a gateway drug. I believe it's used by hardcore addicts as a means of coming down off of their particular addiction. I am fearful that it will be perceived societally as it's okay. It's okay. And I really don't like that. I think that's all I have to say. I know that perhaps my comments are vehement, but I am an alcohol and drug counselor. I understand the implications of marijuana and would really propose that your new ordinance be very strict. Thank you.
Ken Rivas, followed by Svetlana Dayal, if she's here, also another person who was not able to speak last time.
Good afternoon, council members. I have Sebastian Aldana with me. We also have another speaker card in there. I didn't know that you were going to call us up so soon. Thank you for giving us the opportunity, because we didn't have last time. Okay, I'm going to be reading a letter along with Sebastian from Anna Soto, who couldn't be here today, and she is the chairperson for the Franklin Center Advisory Committee. Okay. Dear Ordinance Committee, I am writing to you on behalf of the Franklin Center Advisory Committee, of which I am the chairperson, to let you know of our support and position of the recent Citizen Revised Ordinance number 5449, Regulations and Procedures for Medicinal Cannabis Dispensaries. There has been a significant outcry of concerned residents and merchants of the East Side and surrounding communities regarding cannabis dispensaries opening up near their business, homes, schools, preschools, and daycare centers. At least 3 dispensaries are located in the most highly trafficked school routes used by students of all ages. It begs the question of how many dispensaries the city of Santa Barbara really needs. And on the east side, the Franklin Center and West Side Center advisory committees understand are very sympathetic to people with illnesses such as cancer that benefit from medicinal marijuana. However, we would like the Ordinance Committee to revise the proposed ordinance to limit the number of dispensaries in the city, and that an equal location distribution be in place, so not to inundate the low-income neighborhoods in any one pocket of the community with the dispensaries. The advisory committee found that there are many concerned business owners and neighbors who attended last month's Franklin Center Advisory Committee meeting that formed a neighborhood group to address the current dispensary ordinance. The Franklin Center Advisory Committee also formed a subcommittee to address the dispensary and ordinance concerns. As a side note, I want to recall that the Westside Community Center Advisory Committee had done so back in August of 2007 and provided a community forum for residents to express their concerns of this issue on the city's West Side neighborhood. What the Franklin Center Advisory Committee found was that although the adopted ordinance addresses much of the concerns in 2007, such as exposure to children, break-ins, inappropriate use of the marijuana in and around dispensaries, premises, and documented reselling of the bought marijuana to residential youth outside the dispensaries, there was still an overwhelming opinion that dispensaries need to strict restrictions, regulations. It's also found that there was a consensus that dispensaries not be allowed in residential areas.
You have a minute and a half left.
Okay,
because
I'll do
I'm
it.
giving you each 2 minutes.
Okay. The Franklin Center Advisory Committee combed the neighborhood and Milpa Street businesses, and 90% of those we contacted were opposed to the medical dispensaries. We simply suggest an end to the proliferation of dispensaries and place a cap on the number of dispensaries allowed in the city. Our efforts as an advisory committee is to create a safe and sound environment for families, and we would remiss if we did not prevent revisions, changes that we believe will help toward the effort and end a dangerous trend. Based on the neighborhood resident input and concerns, the Franklin Center Advisory Committee recommends the following: establish a cap on number of dispensaries and spread them throughout the city. The proximity to public facilities, services, agencies, including schools, preschools, rehabilitation centers, should be 1,000 feet. Public notification to include renters when new stores are to be open, not just to owners, as some owners do not live in the neighborhood. The recovery cost built into permitting and renewal of dispensaries, including fines leading to the closure of dispensaries found in violation and out of compliance, a method in which to recover a percentage of its profits for enforcement.
Mr. Aldana, could you wrap up?
Yes. Background checks on individuals opening medical shops and their employees. Again, this is on behalf of Ana Soto, chairperson of Franklin Center.
That's some of that.
Okay, well, he told me to speed it up. Okay,
Did you have one last sentence? Can we allow us?
okay, go ahead.
Okay. We have met with the citizens group and have discussed in length their revision to the ordinance and support the citizen revised ordinance for number 5449 regulation and procedures, and that for medicinal cannabis dispensaries. Thank you, Ana Soto.
Thank you. And is Svetlana Dial here? Then we'll have Scott Stanley come up next. And I just want to give the note. Again, I don't want to cut people off, but if we're going to take action today, we're going to have to move quick.
All right. Well, hi. I'm Scott Stanley. My wife and I own Esau's Cafe and have been in the restaurant business in Santa Barbara for over 31 years. The first 30 years were in what was not a very desirable location on Lower State Street. The entire 30 years right next door to the controversial adult bookstore. And the reason I mention this is because now at our new location on Chapala, there's an uproar over putting another controversial business, medical marijuana store. I feel that I am more than qualified to speak on the impact that such a controversial business has on the surrounding neighborhood, as I was hounded for years to sign petitions and get on the bandwagon to get rid of the adult bookstore. My position as a business owner, as a citizen of Santa Barbara, and a taxpayer is this: if A business meets all code requirements, pays its taxes, abides by all the laws of Santa Barbara, and polices its clientele, then who are we, as fellow business people and citizens of Santa Barbara, to dictate who can and cannot be in business based on our personal beliefs and standards that we have no right to dictate to anyone other than our own families and in our own homes? You know, whether we believe in legalized alcohol, marijuana, or reading material is not relevant. We're talking about a legal, law-abiding, code-enforced business that has every right to exist. I may not like products or clothing styles or food that are sold in other retail stores, but we supposedly live in a country where we abide by the laws and not by the whims and popular or unpopular options. As you all know, Santa Barbara, like the rest of the country, is in a horrible economic slump. On the solely economic stand, I, for one, welcome the addition of a business that would draw people to what is almost a graveyard on Chapala and have no fear about the supposed element that it will allegedly draw, any more than I did on Lower State Street, where I had absolutely no problem in 30 years of peaceful coexistence next to another unpopular yet legal retail business. Okay, thank you.
I am gonna invoke the mayor's. That was very eloquent, and I should probably disclose that I am a patron of ESOS routinely, but we shouldn't have clapping in here, because often what that leads to is then the opposite of that when someone says something that you don't like hissing or booing or talking over them or other things like that. So let's try to keep it straight. We're going to have Carlos Martinez, followed by W. Dugan.
Good morning to everybody. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for everybody who at least has an opinion and will stand up and voice it. I have been a spiritual and medical patient for several years due to anxiety and severe pain from being ran over by a truck on Carrillo. For somebody who doesn't sleep or had the opportunity to sleep for up to 2 hours every day from the pain that I was suffering from, I found the use of dispensaries to be completely enlightening and new to me, but it also changed my life because I went from sleeping 2 hours to sleeping 6 hours with products that were not available in the black market, if you want to call it that, edibles and hash concentrates, which allowed me to sleep for longer periods and become active and useful once again in the community. I believe that a cap would severely hurt competition. Somebody like pharmacy, who has been known to have herbal products that you can drink and ice cream and eat to get rid of pains and ailments so that you didn't have to smoke, is completely refreshing and enlightening and should be allowed for competition so that these types of businesses can continue to be competitive and spurn more profit for that whenever we do get taxed or people get taxed, they can get more return for the amount of businesses that they have. A amount of dispensaries being spoken here about Santa Barbara compared to Oakland doesn't take in consideration that San Francisco has 30-something dispensaries, which is just across the bridge. You have Point Richmond, who has several dispensaries, some right across the street from each other, Emeryville, other communities around, which those people go to work in and can receive their medication. By putting an hour cap, you're now forcing people that work in the community from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. or late hours to not have access to their medication. Or as I was at sometimes a server, whenever we received cash at the end of the night, you then have the ability to get your medication, go home and sleep and rest and get back up. It makes it really hard. So by not allowing these dispensaries to be creative, maybe in having hours of operation, maybe at their business located to a certain time, but to be able to deliver mobily, because there is nothing better or safer for our community than to allow dispensaries to deliver to your home where you're already at and will be consuming the medication. So some of that needs to be allowed for visionary, the same way you have been visionary than other people in the country.
Mr. Martinez, we need
Yes,
you
sir.
to wrap up.
Absolutely. I did want to mention that about schools, that marijuana has been in schools for as long as schools have been around, and the best defense has always been parents being responsible for their own children. 500 feet or 1,000 feet. Kids will go 2,000 feet if they want to. They've gone along the stream. So we should allow some of those things to be visionary as you have been. And thank you for your time. I'll keep it short.
W. Dugan, followed by Maria Dumont.
Howdy, folks. I get a kick out of this because I'm in pain. I feel like I got run over by a truck. I didn't. I was prescribed OxyContin. I don't take it. I get a kick also because I've been around marijuana all my life. I've seen the destruction, the murder, the corruption, and behind it, all the false information. The health department has to get involved with the medical marijuana munchies that they prescribe because they have to be inspected for the health of the community for food. I know people that do that. Where are they going to make these foods? Also, I get a kick out of the tax. Are they going to do this tax for maybe addiction for the people that use marijuana too much? Health problems like lung cancer? Okay, like the tobacco? Driving while intoxicated. How are they going to deliver this? Are they going to go home? Or are they going to go smoke it and eat at that guy's restaurant? I don't understand that because that's driving under the influence. I don't take my medications lightweight because I, in fact, didn't take it this morning because I have to drive, have to walk. I get a kick out also. Are they going to be armed? Are they going to have armored buildings because of the crime involved? I'm from LA, San Fernando Valley. They have a lot of people with guns going in and taking these people over. Are they going to have an armed guard to stop these? Of course, are they going to be using marijuana themselves? The pollution, you can't smoke this stuff like a cigarette, so you're going to have to go home and be isolated. I don't want it. I get sick from it. I don't want to be smelling it. Organized crime. I'd like to see where the contributions go, which campaigns. I know organized crime involved. Being involved with people that work the DEA, knowing officers that have been involved. I know there's money involved in this, and I know where it goes, and I don't like it. The availability of a pill, THC, that's available. Why aren't they prescribing that at a pharmacy? Why are they open up to marijuana? Why are they not controlling what's in the marijuana that they grow? The FDA has to get involved in that. Then what's in the marijuana? Somebody corrupts the marijuana? They didn't like THC in it when it was sprayed. What about somebody corrupting the marijuana? Okay, they're going to do it like Europe?
Mr. Dugan.
Europeans don't pay the tax. Thank you.
Maria Dumont, followed by David Hughes.
As a resident of a mixed-use building downtown, I have suggestions along with many grievances regarding medical marijuana dispensaries locating at such buildings. I support the idea of locating medical marijuana dispensaries at hospitals, existing pharmacies, hospices, and medical facilities. Who is better qualified than those professional entities? Alternatively, identify specific corridors in the city where there are no adjacent residence homes, schools, daycare, rehab facilities, or parks. Placing dispensary in predetermined low-impact zones would serve the greater good over the long term. Allowing marijuana dispensaries to be located in mixed-use buildings set a poor precedent, not only for Santa Barbara, but every community setting their new ordinance. The negative impact on the lives of residents forced to share a building with a marijuana dispensary is not just one of security. Marijuana dispensaries have a negative image. There is a low desirability to reside where a dispensary is located. Resale price and the number of buyers both suffer. Allowing a dispensary in a mixed-use building where residents already live violates the essence of what marketed and sold. By now protecting these residents via ordinance, the city may open itself to legal issues. Not only should mixed-use buildings be excluded in the ordinance, there should be a specific language retroactive to any existing or pending application. Regarding security and crime, anecdotal or short-term data is what was presented at the last meeting. It is confounding that the burden of proof regarding crime and security lies with anyone other than marijuana dispensaries. A dispensary influences the environment. Prudent ordinance would place the burden of facts, impact report, and anecdotal studies ahead of getting conforming dispensaries approved. And I
Ma'am.
am also submitting a few letters from some homeowners that asked that couldn't be present.
Thank you, Mr. Dumont. David Hughes.
Good morning, David Hughes. I'll first speak on behalf of the Housing Commission and then on myself as an individual. Chairman Williams asked the Commission to look at this and get back to you with our formal opinion. The Commission met, staff has worked on this. We provided you with a letter dated yesterday. To summarize, it's our request that you prohibit medical cannabis dispensaries within 500 feet of a residential zone boundary, and prohibit them within 1,000 feet of any existing special needs housing complex such as El Carrillo, Garden Street Apartments, as well as other sober living facilities. We'll be glad to work with your staff in identifying those. As an individual, let me indicate I would first recommend a moratorium on this matter, on this ordinance, primarily for the reason described by your city attorney in response to the question by Mr. Francisco, City Council Member Francisco. The interpretation of Prop 215 and the enabling legislation is evolving as to whether or not what was required, what was allowed, and whether storefront dispensaries are the way in which the citizens of the state intended the law to be. If that is unrealistic, I would support, in one regard, the request of the school district that you limit the location of the dispensaries to 1,000 feet from schools. And I would cite to you as a model, and the reason for that, to be consistent with state law and to reduce enforcement. State law and Health and Safety Code section 11362.79 prohibits the smoking of medical marijuana within 1,000 feet of the grounds of a school, a recreational center, or a youth center. I think you should add those terms of youth center and recreational center to whatever your prohibition may be. But you can see that if we have a 1,000-foot prohibition as to smoking of medical marijuana within the grounds of those facilities, we create an anomaly in enforcement by having locations within 500 feet, but no smoking within 1,000 feet. It would be consistent with state law to have the boundaries be, or the measuring mark be 1,000 feet from these grounds. I recognize that would limit the number of locations for medical marijuana dispensaries, but there's a good rationale for it. You're consistent with state law, and it avoids and reduces enforcement problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hughes. Just for your information, the current ordinance does not allow people to smoke or consume on site. In fact, there's only a small exemption for staff if they are also patients to consume by not smoking. So we do not allow the smoking on the site of the locations currently. Chester Hugh Marsh, followed by Thomas Byrne.
All right. Thank you very much. My name is Hugh Marsh, and I just have a couple of short comments. Excuse me. One is my personal experience with medical marijuana is one that is used for pain alleviation. I suffer from the post-polio syndrome and a lot of pain with that. And the marijuana is helping me get off the real hard drugs, OxyContin and Vicodin, that sort of thing. These were recommended by my family doctors and by a pain MD therapist here in town who were glad that I was considering using marijuana instead of some of these other drugs. And indeed, it is helping me get rid of, stop the use of some of these drugs. I would just like to add that my experience with existing dispensaries is that they're a very benign presence in the neighborhood, and I wouldn't, I don't see them as any particular danger or threat. Another thing is a little bit off the track of this, but Das, particularly, you know my involvement with ADA, And I don't think there's anything in this that says anything about dispensaries having to comply with ADA. I suppose they will, but I would like that to be considered in the American with Disabilities Act. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Marsh. Thomas Byrne, followed by William Lee.
Members of the committee, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Thomas Byrne. I represent a relatively small, locally owned and operative collective, namely AMG at 100 East Haley. I'm also the owner of that property, and it is a mixed-use building. Although this dispensary is run in very strict compliance with the current ordinance, it's non-conforming because of its close proximity to a city park. Unfortunately, that was just the luck of the draw. I feel that if the amortization period is reduced and there's a moratorium which is retroactive, this could put us between a rock and a hard place. We currently have an application in on another location, which is 2 blocks away, which is geographically conforming. And I think we have a pretty substantial patient list. It's quite difficult if you increase the distance, what you're proposing. It's going to give a monopoly to a very small number of dispensaries, which, in my opinion, will cause a lot of congestion around this small number of dispensaries and probably only increase the concerns of the opponents to dispensaries. Obviously, I visited San Francisco recently, and I noticed this in Berkeley. There's a smaller number of dispensaries in that area, and there's a lot of congestion and big parking issues around some of these larger dispensaries. I think it's important also, in relation to our location, to mention that at the last meeting, the police did state that there was a substantial number of calls to that particular area, but not one call has come from that dispensary, which is important to note. Also, in regards to some of the proposals in this new draft, I think it's unreasonable to ask dispensaries to close their doors 1/2 hour before schools open and 1/2 hour after they close and during the lunch break, because I think this is probably the actual times that patients would be working around their work schedule to visit dispensaries. No students are allowed in anyway, but they wouldn't be allowed anywhere near a dispensary. Also, the security camera situation, having to...
Mr. Byrne, could you wrap up?
Yes. Also, I do agree with an ordinance. I think it's important. I think dispensaries welcome an ordinance of some kind, but I think you can overdo it in regards to some of the restrictions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Byrne. Mr. Lee, followed by Jeff Bray.
Thank you very much. My name is William Leahy. My wife and I will be coming to Santa Barbara to manage the pharmacy on Chapala, and I would like to speak on behalf of that this morning. And I also wanted to present to the board here. I have a letter from a very private school in West Hollywood that is in support, that are near the pharmacy, and has created an alliance of more safety for the school and the neighborhood. And I also have an impact reports from the American for Safe Access that I would like to present to you. And I also would like to present to you our oldest patient, who turned 103 on February 5th. Our average patient is 40 years of age. Having a location on Chapala is very nice because it's really a question about medicine and access to that medicine. And when we have these things, I've heard people, it seems to be a fear of the unknown. I've heard some people concerned about economics for themselves. We forget that this is medicine. This is for people that need the medicine. And we provide safe access. We provide all of the things that are required by the state law, by the city laws, and that we would like to take the Chapala property, which has been vacant for quite some time, and turn it into a very beautiful store that will be something that this lady and other people, and we have to remember that this is someone's grandmother, great-grandmother, or whatever. And lastly, I'd like to say that most people become converts to the situation when it affects themselves or affects someone in their lives, and then they see the true value of medical marijuana. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Jeff Bray, followed by John Campanella.
Hi, my name is Jeff Bray, and I just want to clear something up. From the Congress of the United States, I wrote him a letter February 11th, 2004, and I'll read the letter as quick as I can. I am writing to update you on your concerns, and this is to Lois Capps, concerns with subsidized housing through the government and the influence of your medical condition on this issue. My staff has corresponded with Dr. Bierman to keep him informed of your current situation, and I am aware that you remain in contact with him as well. I understand that he has provided you with necessary documentation to inform others of the marijuana treatment for your medical condition. Due to current laws in Congress, federal regulations have a zero tolerance policy involving individuals living in subsidized housing. Now here's the trick. Therefore, if your landlord is concerned about your growth of marijuana, he or she is authorized to terminate your lease or to terminate the rental agreement. The fact of the matter is, if I'm a low-income person and I decide to put big bulbs in my house to grow my marijuana plants, my electricity bill is going to cost more than my rent. Okay, so I got to depend on the dispensaries. The dispensaries are the ones that need to be growing, not me, not my house. So I have to fight the federal government to prove them that I've got rights too. Okay, let me finish this off. Okay, and the rest of it is to Washington, D.C. office, and the case, write to them. And I don't have their address right here. Let's see. I've got their phone number. It's area code 805-730-1710. And then this is the last one, I'll be done. Reimbursement of cannabis under public assistance. A California court decided in September 2006 that medical cannabis users with a low income who receive public assistance benefits from the state may qualify for reimbursement for the cost of medical
Bray,
cannabis.
we need you to wrap up.
I'm almost done. The case centered on Sylvia Price, who used medical cannabis to alleviate pain. Ms. Price sought and received reimbursement for the cost of her medical cannabis under Lake County's Public Assistance Program 203 when Lake County stopped reimbursing Ms. Price, claiming that federal law prohibited it from doing so. In September, the administration court finally resolved the issue for making it clear that federal cannabis laws do not prevent the state from honoring its medical cannabis laws. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bray. John Campanella, followed by Randy Rouse.
Morning. I'm John Campanella, representing the Paseo Chapala Owners Association and also the developer of BDC Paseo Chapala LLC. The homeowners board had submitted a letter at the last meeting. I don't want to repeat too much what we said, but in that letter was a concern about mixed-use developments going forward, but also asking for confirmation that under the current ordinance 288060, interpretation that on parcels zoned for residential use, notwithstanding anything about the commercial zone allowance, a dispensary would not be allowed or permitted on a parcel zoned for residential use. Paseo Chapala existed prior to the current ordinance going into effect. There were people living in the units, and we'd like to confirm that in order to save a lot of expense of everyone who's going forward and try to get a project approved, that if in effect it is determined not to be allowed, that come to a forefront now and that be explained to us. There's a number of areas that, as far as dispersing, State Street right now, most of the downtown prohibits dispensaries. I don't have the history of why that is. and even Paseo Nuevo prohibits it all the way to Chapala Street. No dispensaries allowed in a commercial area that does not have any residences. So from a standpoint of dispersion and fairness, we really don't feel that it should be allowed in Paseo Chapala, and we'd like confirmation that since it is residentially zoned under the pyramid zoning for the city, that that is the case. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Campanella. Randy Rouse, followed by Jeff Rowland.
Mr. Chair, members of the Ordinance Committee, your constituents, your neighbors, and your friends are before you here again today. The business, cultural, educational, social service, and residential communities are speaking to you directly and very clearly. We have put aside the business of our lives to come here again today because this is an important community-wide problem. We are asking for action, and we are asking for it now. The time to wait and see is over. An immediate moratorium makes sense and is imperative for the city to gather the input needed to incorporate this idea in a sane manner and to avoid the runaway growth, abuse, and confrontation we currently are experiencing. Shut down the illegal facilities now. Illegal does not warrant a grace period, and we, as citizens, have a reasonable expectation that you and not us will act as the enforcement agent. Form an ad hoc commission to create policy made up of facets of government, police, citizens, and take this issue off the backs of Planning Commission and zoning. You know, at the last meeting, you asked us to provide direction as to where to locate these dealerships, and that isn't our concern. There's no civic mandate that we have to have these facilities in town. All three of you on the dais today are candidates. You've spoken at length about neighborhood preservation, business vitality, social welfare, and public safety. And Mr. Chair, you've come out as an advocate for the schools in your current campaign. You've heard from our school administrators, teachers, and parents, and they're asking for your help in this manner. What you do or say today can enhance or diminish your stated positions. We all have our varied reasons for voting for whichever candidate we choose. Leadership is the one trait that we as citizens all commonly seek. You have a golden opportunity to show us who can lead now and in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rouse. Jeffrey Rowland, followed by Alina Kitson.
Good afternoon. Hi, my name is Jeffrey Rowland, and I'm a resident of downtown Santa Barbara. There are a number of issues that have been brought up about cannabis dispensaries, both today and in the last meeting on September 15th. I'm going to limit my comments to the one issue that is important to me, and that is the lack of any ordinance provisions regarding mixed-use residential commercial parcels. It's clear that the intention of the ordinance is to restrict the dispensaries from being located in residential zones, including the RO residential office zones. In other words, dispensaries are not allowed to operate where people live. And in the case of the residential office zones, they're not allowed to operate in mixed-use areas adjacent to where people live. The cannabis dispensary application that's required by the City of Santa Barbara specifically asks if there are any adjacent residential parcels to the proposed dispensary location. In fact, the city application asks about parcels north, south, east, and west. The pharmacy, a cannabis dispensary that's currently applying for permission to operate in the building where I live, was able to answer no to those questions regarding residential parcels because although we are residential, there are 29 residential units in our building, and we are adjacent 16 inches away from their proposed location, we are not technically residential. The application neglects to ask about residents in all adjacent directions, including above, or for example, southwest, where in fact there is an adjacent residential parcel. So I would say that their no is a little bit disingenuous. Both the current ordinance and the city regulation, the city required application support the clear intention to restrict cannabis dispensaries from the areas where people live, including mixed-use residential complexes. I urge you to clarify the residential restrictions by adding specific language that prohibits medical cannabis dispensaries from operating in mixed-use commercial residential buildings. Also, please add clarifying language to prohibit cannabis dispensaries operating in any location adjacent to an actual place where people live. The residents of downtown Santa Barbara, myself and others, deserve the same protections and cannabis dispensary restrictions as the residents of the rest of the city. Please address this gap in the medical dispensary ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rowland. Lena Kitson.
Hi, I'm also a resident and property owner in downtown Santa Barbara. I would like the current medical cannabis dispensary ordinance to be clarified to address the presence, again, of multi-use commercial and residential buildings in Santa Barbara. A marijuana dispensary is not an appropriate business to be located directly below and adjacent to family residences. As I understand it, marijuana dispensaries are not allowed in residential or residential office zones and should also not be allowed in residential commercial buildings. Based on the application required by the City of Santa Barbara for the operation of a marijuana dispensary, I can see that the heightened security requirements, the parking requirements that don't match our parking situation, and the illegality under federal law make this an inappropriate business for mixed-use buildings, such as where I and 28 other families live. I understand that living in downtown Santa Barbara and being near commercial businesses is a different residential experience than living in most residential zones. However, the building that we live in is not currently a high security building, and I don't want to live in the type of secure building that seems to be required by the city for a marijuana dispensary. The addition of restricted access, security guards, and security cameras as required for the running of a marijuana dispensary would be a detriment to the quality of life and my enjoyment of my home. I am not opposed to the existence of medical cannabis dispensaries, but I do believe that there need to be further restrictions. Please update the restrictions to include not allowing dispensaries to be located in mixed-use buildings. Thank you.
Terry Tyler, followed by John Becchio.
Thank you, committee members. My name is Terry Tyler. I'm here today as a concerned citizen. I think at this juncture it might be a good idea to step back and take a look at the big picture of not only where and when, but what. What exactly are these dispensaries selling? Who's regulating what they sell? I don't see any oversight whatsoever, no consumer protection in place, no FDA oversight concerning content labeling or product safety, no state ag oversight regarding how the product is grown or packaged or processed, no county oversight concerning weights and measures or health inspections of these so-called retail facilities, no quality control whatsoever, no consumer protection. A lot of these products are being purchased for ingestion. I think we need to really take a look at this before we go down this slippery slope. I don't see that there's any control over what's being sold at all. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Tyler. John Becchio, followed by Janet Rouse.
Thank you very much. John Becchio, principal of Santa Barbara Junior High. Thanks for hearing us today. I come before you to ask for a very restrictive ordinance and also to ask for a very good policy with respect to enforcement of that ordinance. And here's why. In my daily work, I'm reminded of what it is to be a leader of the school community and the responsibility that bears with respect to the message that I'm sending to kids. And we're looking to you as leaders of our community. And I want to remind you that there's a message you're going to be sending to our kids. The decisions you make, the words you use, the actions you take will be a message to our kids. And I wanted to bring forward that reminder to you today. The message there will be a message in the number of dispensaries you allow in our community. There will be a message in the number of dispensaries you allow around our schools. There will be a message in the number of dispensaries you allow in, for example, the Milpas corridor and the impact that that will have on the East Side community. Parents were mentioned earlier by one of the speakers, and I want to testify to you that our parents are doing a fabulous job at this concept of sending a message to their kids. And they do need help in that, though. They need me as a principal to send a message with the policies and actions and words I use with our kids. And I know they're looking to you to to also reinforce the message that they're sending to their kids. You all have, finally, you all have sided on the side of schools in support of our schools. Councilmember House is a significant part of our school community over the last 12 years that I've known him. And again, I ask that you really think about the message you're sending to our kids. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Becchio. Janet Rouse, followed by Nancy Harder.
Hi there. I'm a parent and a longtime school volunteer. It's imperative that you vote or decide to shut down all of the legal and illegal dispensaries and send this ordinance back to the council for review while you figure out all of these various problems that you're hearing about today. Our city feels less safe every day. The streets are dirty, stores are empty, and it's only going to get worse. Marijuana dealerships, or dispensaries as you call them, are proliferating in neighborhoods at an alarming rate. Children are now less safe at home and on their way to school. Safety to grow to one's fullest potential is a child's right. Parents and schools are working every day to ensure that children flourish and grow in their care. Your vote to keep this ordinance in its current form is a vote against children and education and will not be forgotten. Thank you.
Nancy Harder, followed by Forrest Buchanan.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Nancy Harder, and I come to you as a citizen, but I was formerly a school board member in the Santa Barbara School Districts for 8 years. I've had firsthand experience with the devastating consequences to students and families of the suspension and expulsion process for marijuana use. As reported previously by district officials, suspensions for marijuana use are on the rise because of the easier access to the drug in many, many forms. Knowing that there are unintended consequences to children as a result of the proliferation of dispensaries as allowed by the current ordinance, I have to ask you, why wouldn't you take the time to consider what is in the best interest of our children? I strenuously urge you to initiate immediate moratorium until the Santa Barbara School District recommendations can be considered and incorporated into a revised ordinance. Thank you so much.
Forrest Buchanan, followed by Joe Allen.
Good afternoon. I oppose any changes to the ordinance and yield my speaking time to Joseph Allen.
Joe Allen, followed by Joanna LaForce.
Thank you, Chairman Williams.
Guess you get an extra minute or so.
Thank you. I want to respond to some of the concerns by parents and teachers by reminding the committee that when Captain Martell spoke to you at the last session of your committee and mentioned that there were 453, I think was the number, of marijuana violations for which the city police issued citations in the relevant year, that none of those people were medical marijuana users. People who have valid doctor's letters do not get cited by the police and, in fact, cannot be cited by the police for possessing or transporting medicinal marijuana. The problem is that side by side with the legal regulated dispensaries whose conditions of operation you are considering, you have a black market in marijuana which is uncontrolled and essentially uncontrollable. It has existed long before Proposition 215. It has existed for 30, 40, probably 50 years in Santa Barbara and every other community I know about in California. It existed before the medicinal marijuana law, and it will exist afterward as it exists side by side with it at the present time. Don't confuse the problems created, for example, at junior high schools and high schools with the illicit black market availability of marijuana, with the stories of patients who have come before you, some of them in their 40s, some of them in their 60s, some of them much older, who have nothing to do with distributing marijuana first or second hand to junior high school students and are seeking relief from pain, relief from migraine headaches, relief from the
side effects of chemotherapy for cancer, and who do not deserve to be forced into the black market because too many regulations were passed concerning legal, well-run, well-lighted, secure dispensaries. If someone is dispensing marijuana illegally to junior high school students, arrest them and prosecute them. If someone is operating dispensaries without appropriate permits from the city, close them. But don't deprive legitimate medical patients with valid letters from their doctors of clean, effective, safe access to a legal medicine in California. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Joanna LaForce, followed by Brian Sarvis.
Thank you again for allowing me to speak. Again, as a resident of Santa Barbara for 17 years, and from my experience sitting on working groups for both Los Angeles and West Hollywood, the best way to work through these ordinance concerns is with, I believe, one, alliances of businesses. We are now in the process of establishing an alliance of approved and applicant collectives to establish accreditation protocols for good operational standards, including compassionate care programs, good neighbor policies, procurement and dispensing limitations to eliminate profiteering and diversion. Secondly, these revisions are going to take time to work through, and I'm urging the committee to form a working group of stakeholders with the facilitators so that all concerns and ideas can be heard and worked through efficiently and effectively. In addition, should a moratorium be considered at any point, I urge that it be a moratorium on any further applications, as the current pending applications have done all the work required, invested considerable time and resources under the current ordinance to get them to this point. Lastly, I would like to ask you to give the pharmacy a chance. We're offering a fresh face to the medicinal cannabis movement. Some of the recommendations the citizens draft include are highly restrictive and unenforceable. If the El Pueblo Viejo limitations are adopted, the pharmacy would be out of operation in 3 months. People that have chosen to live in mixed use chose to live in a commercial area. The pharmacy is a natural herb shop, of which one of the medicines we offer is medical cannabis. If there is an area cap, we would like to be the collective in the West Side quadrant. A physician I spoke to said there should be equal number of natural pharmacies as there are traditional pharmacies. I counted them, there's 13. Thank you.
Good afternoon, council members. I'm Brian Sarvis, Superintendent of Santa Barbara School Districts. I spoke to you at our last meeting about problems posed by the dispensaries for our students. We have too many students who obtain the marijuana from the dispensaries, coming to school high, selling it to others on campuses. I also presented the recommendations from our School Board of Education to the council. I'm requesting today that you move quickly to shut down the dispensaries that are close to our schools and the paths of travel from our schools, especially from school to home, and that you undertake measures to keep them away from schools in the future. Looking at the list of dispensaries, whether they are operating, non-operating, non-conforming, approved, or pending, I count 3 that are located within 2 blocks of one of our junior high schools. I count 2 that are within 2 blocks of one of the county schools. This is a school that's attended by students who have been expelled from our schools, many of them for drug-related offenses. We would prefer that you shut down the Milpas corridor altogether. One of our students told me that thanks to the dispensaries and the availability of the cards, that this stuff is becoming so easy to get, we may as well put it in our vending machines. I am here today with parents and with school board members who are very concerned about the issue and who are looking to you to safeguard and protect our children. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sarvis. Hans Edwards. followed by Stanley Boydston.
Honorable council members, appreciate the opportunity to speak. My name is Hans Edwards, and I'm involved in the 2 West Mission dispensary project. From my own experience in working with the community, a lot of people who have concerns about the project or who were completely opposed to it at the beginning, once I approached them and was willing to discuss their concerns, discuss how we would deal to meet these concerns, no longer had a problem with the project. And a majority of the opponents dropped their opposition and to give this project a chance. So I don't know how you measure the amount of opposition that you're perceiving by the numbers of speakers or whatever, but I believe that I found that the opposition was a lot less than what I had expected. In a recent Fortune magazine article, we saw a graph that indicated that the trend of approval and acceptance of medical marijuana is still rising. So I don't think this is a time for a moratorium. The ordinance needs to produce acceptable dispensaries. There is a belief that it can work given a chance, and it really hasn't been seen. The legal ones have yet not been seen to how they're going to function. I could make a number of recommendations. You may want to create a profile that describes the acceptable applicant, based on, let's say, his age and experience, the nature of his motivation, his trustworthiness, his knowledge and understanding of the cannabis phenomenon, his interest and background in medical application, his interest in community and charitable contributions. It might be good to start with the applicant and based on a profile of what you expect him to be.
Mr. Edwards, we're going to have to ask you to wrap up. Just in terms of our time limits, just
yes. The most difficult thing for an applicant is to find a landlord that is willing to take him in. Even the people that are in favor of cannabis don't want the stigma associated with having such a business in their premise. So this is the most difficult thing for the applicant that he finds. And I think that it would be good to take your map and map further locations where you would like to see dispensaries exist, and mail into those areas, and perhaps give an incentive to the landlords to come forward and allow them to come in there, so that you could have them well spaced out, and have that basis for a tax possibility of a tax earning that this city really needs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Edwards. Stanley Boydston, followed by Sharon Byrne.
Hello, everybody. My name is Stanley Boydston, and I'd like to say everyone is really brave for coming here today and discussing such an important issue. And it's really very scary that someone, a student, has made the statement that the superintendent, I believe it was, mentioned about getting medical cannabis. And I think that reflects maybe a little bit of the spirit in which the current guidelines are formed. And I appreciated Dale Francisco's question to the city attorney about Proposition 215, because I feel like when the permit was fabricated, it seemed as if there was no regard to Senate Bill 420, Proposition 215, or the Attorney General's guidelines. And I think with infusing more of the collective idea within the dispensary project that we have, and Dr. Behrman made an eloquent description of the whole history of dispensaries, but if we infused a few more ideas from the collective process that's described in 420, 215, and the Attorney General's guidelines, I believe we could establish a closer relationship with the members of the dispensaries instead of having a dispensary and, oh yeah, we're a collective. I think it's the other way around. We've made it that we do this backwards, where we have a dispensary, oh yeah, and then we're a collective. But if we start with the collective, we can have a closer relationship with the members. Also, establishing very strict protection, requiring dispensaries to put in a lot of money, requires them not to be so selective as to who the members of the dispensaries are. And if you don't put in a lot of money, you have it's more membership based, and you can really keep an eye on that. So I would just ask everyone to look into that.
Thank you, Mr. Boydston. Sharon Byrne, followed by Patricia Poet.
Good afternoon. My name is Sharon Byrne, and I'm also a parent of a child at Santa Barbara Junior High School. So obviously I'm very concerned about the number of dispensaries that are locating there. I would like to point out that the city attorney did a very good job of saying how Proposition 215 does not contain language that permits dispensaries. Neither does Senate Bill 420, neither does the State Attorney General Guidelines. Dispensaries are a notion invented by canna-business. And this is a very big business. As you have heard from a lot of dispensary operators today, they even have an attorney representing them and several proponent groups that are very organized. I would like to point out that canna-business is actually against marijuana legislation for legalization. The reason being that if the state legalizes it, which they could next year, it's on the ballot for 2010, if they do legalize it, it will be up to the state to regulate and run marijuana as a full-on legal product. They will probably overturn whatever dispensary model a city enacts in favor of some other unknown model. I'd like you to keep that in mind. The current medical marijuana practice in this city of allowing dispensaries is actually to allow serious recreational use. It's not compassionate intent, and it is a big business. I would like you to realize that you are being lobbied hard by canna-business, and that parents and communities have a hard time getting heard. This is an election year. I'd like to ask if what we really meant to create is a city full of legal dispensaries. Is that really the Santa Barbara that we wanted to live in? Is that really what we wanted to expose our children to? There are people saying, well, bad things haven't happened. No, I disagree. Los Angeles just had 16 armed robberies and 2 shootings. We've had an armed extortion, and we've had kids on campus getting product from dispensaries. Bad things have happened. You don't have to have dispensaries. No other city in the county has them. And other cities that have enacted bans, their bans have been appealed and upheld. There's nothing forcing us to have dispensaries. State law provides adequate means for cultivation and distribution of medical marijuana without ever having the first dispensary opened. So I'd like to ask you again to follow some of the recommendations advocated by other parents at Santa Barbara Junior High. You can put in a moratorium. You can put in a ban. All that is within your means to do if political will exists. And many of the citizens would like to see that. We didn't intend to live in a city with a high proliferation of legal or otherwise dispensaries. Thank you.
Thank you. Patricia Poet, followed by Heather Poet. Okay. Then Heather Poet, followed by Billy Walt.
That was a letter from our lawyer that my mother was going to read. I would like to speak to the fact that dispensaries need lawyers because this is a very complicated issue, as you well know, listening to all of this. I wanted to thank you for being here and to start off by saying I sincerely believe that the citizens of Santa Barbara, the neighborhood groups, and the concerned parents of Santa Barbara, as well as the patients and the providers, dispensaries, collectives, want the same thing: a safe community with less crime. As I've said, there's more legal concerns that have been addressed by the letters prepared by our lawyer, Derek Weston. There are important points, and we hope you find it beneficial. However, I'm here today to speak to the more personal side of our community's concerns. My family and I distribute medical cannabis here in Santa Barbara, and these concerns are not lost on myself, my family, our coworkers, or the patients that come to us to find relief for various illnesses. Obviously, open communication between citizens, the local lawmakers, and dispensaries is what is best for our city, and we are glad to see it happening. For just about 8 years now, my family has struggled against the tide to continue providing medical cannabis through the daily looming threat of possible DEA raids, to DEA and Department of Justice threats of asset forfeiture to our landlord. We have spent much of our lives and many countless hours and sleepless nights on this battle. My father began doing this because he has always held and asserted the belief that the herb cannabis does no real harm and there is no reason it should not be available for those that truly need it. My mother shares this belief, and I eventually learned to respect and admire the plant more than I can ever effectively explain in any amount of minutes. This belief was only strengthened when we found out that my brother was HIV positive. I am very proud of my parents and my brother and the people that work with us. I am very proud to provide an herb to those who are sick and dying. I am proud to pay our taxes so that the state might have to work more during this desperate deficit. And I am proud to provide the people that work with us a living wage in these hard times. They are very happy about it as well. Things have not been easy, but we've decided to embark down this road. And we believe that done correctly and compassionately, dispensing medical cannabis is a fulfilling job and a benefit to the community. And there is a benefit in knowing you are doing something to make people feel better. We would like to continue to do our jobs and invite proper, thoughtful advice and regulations. But it would appear that the proposed revisions to the ordinance, in our case especially reducing the amortization period for us as a non-conforming dispensary, would seek to completely shut us down without ample time or ability to locate properly. Even though we are non-conforming based on locational requirements, we have always, before there were any operational requirements, complied with those before they actually even existed. We plead with the council to keep the current amortization period as is so that businesses that have been doing their jobs properly for long periods of time can continue to find a way to provide cannabis to sick patients in the future. There are some definitely positive additions within the Citizen Revised Ordinance, such as the proposed community meetings. We think this is an excellent proposition, and I commend the citizen group for including this addition, as well as encouraging other herbal remedies. These are smart and helpful proposals, and we agree with them wholeheartedly. Do I have any more time left? No.
Billy Walt, followed by Tony Vasallo.
Good afternoon, City Council. I'm Billy Walt, and I am medically deferred from the Army, and I am in favor of having safe access. I was requested today to read Dr. Beardman's letter. Some of the points have already been mentioned. He does in this letter draw attention to criteria 7, 9, and 10 of some of your concerns, so I would ask you to look at it. In this letter, he also indicates to please be mindful of the Constitution amendments, the 9th and 10th Amendment, and also to look at our history. Hemp was grown in this country in the 1800s and 1900s. It was this particular variety of the plant that we're talking about was used by many people for medicinal purposes. Later on, it was marketed by Lilly, Squibb, Merck, Parker Davis, and other pharmaceutical companies and sold in America. So I hope that you will give these concerns attention.
Thank you. Tony Vasallo, followed by Kathleen Go.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. As you know, I'm Tony Vasallo. I'm a downtown resident, and as you know, I worked on the citizen revisions to the ordinance and submitted them to all of you. And I guess the question that I have now goes to the attorney's comments and what I've learned just this morning. And I'll quote this. This is from Los Angeles. Over-the-counter sales of marijuana in exchange for money and the profitability are illegal under California law. That comes from the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office. In addition to that, the city attorney now has taken the position that the dispensary model itself is not something that the city wants, and they are going against it altogether. That comes from the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office. They are rejecting the medical marijuana dispensary model. Now, with those kinds of things on the table, I realize that the issue is advancing faster than your committee can put it on the agenda, because what's on the agenda is the ordinance, but what's happening in the real world is legal challenges and backlash to the whole notion and concept of the legality of dispensaries, as was just pointed out earlier by your attorney, Mr. Wiley. In this environment, does it make any sense to do anything other than take an extremely careful, cautious steps on this whole matter? Slow down, look at the case law, let's see how these cases shake down, let's see what the courts say in terms of the difference between medical cannabis as outlined in Prop 215 and this whole idea of this emerging world of cannabis dispensaries. It's really up to you to decide whether you're going to go forward or take a rest and a break and stop and see how some of these state issues turn out.
Mr. Vassal.
Because the last point I'll make is there's legal on both sides. If it comes down that the dispensary model is not even legal, all your work is for naught, and so are all the revisions I wrote. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vassal. Kathleen, go. Followed by Kathleen Bauschke.
Dear committee members, my name is Kathleen Gu, and I'm also a resident of the Paseo Chapala Association. And I have a letter here I wanted to read from a fellow resident, Mr. Tom Herrick. He is a resident and an owner with a wife and 2 children. He's very concerned about the medical marijuana store that is applicant for the Chapala De La Guerra location. And we happen to have an open garage area, which is enclosed, where the residents and the commercial patrons utilize. There are many issues with the garage being inadvertently used for drug users, homeless, graffiti taggers, and vandals. And this is despite the prohibit for the smoking around the location. It represents another layer of concern for his family. He'd be forced to move from his home if the store is located in that building, and he cannot risk the consequences of having a store add to the safety and quality of life for his children. He strongly urges a marijuana dispensary to be located outside the residential mixed-use building, in proximity to 30 other families. I support all the previous comments for urging restriction from residential when I consider my building mixed-use building residential. And I support the dispensaries allowance into the CO and C1 zones for medical facility areas. I support a cap for the number of dispensaries, and I urge you to consider that these are our homes, and to have strangers tramping in and out and using up our parking space. We did meet with the pharmacy applicants with an open mind, and we respectfully asked them to take marijuana off the menu and not have it included in their bill of fare, but they categorically refused. And we were support holistic medicines, but we asked them respectfully to take marijuana off the bill of fare, and they refused. It represented, from what they told us, too much of their profit margin. Thank you.
Council members, my name is Kathleen Boschke. I'm the Executive Director of Transition House, Santa Barbara's homeless shelter for families with children. And I'm here today to speak in support of the citizens' revision of the ordinance. In both my professional and personal life, I have seen over and over again the abuse of medicinal marijuana. It is not hard to get a certificate, and over again, we've seen people that obtain them only to sell the marijuana to their friends or share it with them. I have no wish to prevent someone who has legitimate medical reason for using marijuana to prevent them from being able to access it. However, because of the abuse that does go on with this drug, we have to regulate how and where people can access medicinal marijuana. I'm particularly concerned because recently the Planning Commission approved a dispensary on the 600 block of Olive Street. The backyard of that property abuts the homeless shelter, our property. In our homeless shelter on any given night, there are over 40 children living there. A number of their parents who are there are in recovery programs, and they do not want to be around circumstances where there is use of drugs or alcohol. It's difficult for them. It's a temptation. As you also know, down at the end of that block of Olive, we run an affordable housing project, and recently the city has granted us funds to further develop the property and add more housing for special needs populations. That special needs population that we seek to serve specifically are people with chronic drug and alcohol abuse problems. Additionally, we're surrounded by housing authority properties that also house very vulnerable populations. We need to give these people a chance to get their lives together by limiting the medicinal marijuana dispensaries in our neighborhood. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Boschke. Robert Fedor, followed by Britta Bartels.
Good afternoon, Chair Williams, committee members, House and Francisco. I just wanted to reiterate from last meeting, I think a great opportunity would be for this idea of a Southern Santa Barbara collective alliance where it would be fashioned like a neighborhood council meeting where you'd have an educational component, you'd have a public comment component, and then you could address specific issues on the agenda. All the operating dispensaries would have a small placard in the front window with a phone number and a dedicated hotline. I think it would greatly reduce a lot of fear and anxiety within the neighborhood. If they could, in the various neighborhoods, people could, have a dialogue, work things out, reduce the city and the staff's time as well as the police's time. There's a lot of other things I'd like to talk about, but in the issue, you guys are crunched for time, so I do thank you for your time, and I do think it's inappropriate for people to kind of threaten you. I think you guys are doing a great job. On a closing note, I work in Los Angeles daily. I work with Daisy Moe in room 753 of the 200 Spring Street City Hall building, and I'm not familiar with any of the things that some of the people have talked about with Los Angeles calling dispensaries illegal.
Britta Bartels, followed by Ray Maboob.
Hi, I'm Britta Bartels, and I have been worried about our dispensary history so far since June 17th. And I think that we really have to work on this soon because it's getting more and more and more. And since you guys got the ordinance for revision on July 28th, I think there has been plenty of time to work on this besides preparing for the election. I would make this as part of your campaign to address the need of keeping our Santa Barbara city beautiful, peaceful, not looking like Amsterdam, like some people might have picked up when they traveled over there and started in San Francisco, to Europeanize, this fancy drug. I still call it drug. I know people need it for medicine, but the 2% that are documented as reliable patients, they can get it from one dispensary, and I would drive to a dispensary if I would really need it as a patient and not as a recreational abuser. And I think it's about the money. One sign is that the planning division increased the appeal letter fee from $180 to $300, which is an extra income, of course, for the city. So I think that's why the city is kind of taking it easy to make this get finished up as a problem that we as the public want to be dressed up. And we have plenty of people who spoke up and said that they don't want all these dispensaries. And we elected you, and I think you should really consider this as something that seems to get more and more strange and is more fought by us. And I also wanted to say that there are a lot of other natural remedies that are taking care of pain. I would like to refer to homeopathy. There are a lot of herbs that do not make you feel like you are in heaven when you smoke it and driving a car and having a little accident going on. So one of my patients crashed his car because he OD'd on his brownies he likes to bake and eat. He spends a lot of money, about $400 a month, on having brownies 24/7. And he has actually a severe depression from the consumption of THC. And now he even has a broken collarbone because he was not able to keep control of his car while driving, and he lost the car too. So I think we should really wake up, smell the coffee, not worry about losing votes, even if we have a lot of people who would not vote for you because they want to get high on this recreational drug. I think you should still see what you think about it and not please the people that like to be high on the job. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Britta. Ray Mahboub, followed by Mike Jordan, and I will just not tell my aunts and uncles that live in Amsterdam what you said, Britta. But
thanks for letting me speak for the second time. I'm Ray Mahboub, and I'm the landlord at Paseo Chapala. And prior to coming here, I saw someone distributing flyers accusing me as part owner of the pharmacy and I'm greedy and this and that. So I'm here to, for the record, to let everyone know that, one, I'm not the owner of the pharmacy or part owner. I'm the landlord. I do not own Silver Greens. I'm the landlord. I'm a landlord for a lot of successful restaurants and retailers in downtown Santa Barbara. If it wasn't for me, we wouldn't have Saigon In-N-Out coming from Milpas onto State Street. We wouldn't have a Forever 21 store. We wouldn't have Tupelo Junction, American Apparel, Blue Bee Jeans, the area. I mean, I could go down the list of successful businesses that I brought to downtown. And I believe we do need a cap. I believe we do need good dispensaries, reputable ones, and that is what I've done. I brought the pharmacy. They've got registered nurses. They've got over 300 herbs outside of just selling cannabis, and I think that they'll do extremely well, and they'll also regulate and abide by the rules and regulations of the city and the state. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mahboub. Mike Jordan, followed by Rosa Chavez.
Good afternoon, Chair and Committee. Each of you know that I have 4 school-age children in the house, ranging from a sophomore in high school to a junior at UC. And as I've told you before, I support an appropriate number of medical marijuana dispensaries in town that are enforced. But I continue to think that list places an unfair burden on parents, a burden that I don't want. And I can't think I can think of few other things that should be paramount in your position and your 4 peers that will eventually this will eventually get in front of. And that should not be to increase my parenting burdens. You should, in fact, be taking steps to do the opposite. Pretty much everything that you've heard today in that vein, I support. Caps, I support increasing the distances from schools, increasing the distances between dispensaries. I also think that you should set up an annual review either at PC or City Council so this becomes a review process rather than a complaint-driven process as this goes forward. And I think the 3 of you and your 4 peers should also remove any talk of tax revenue or additional city revenue from this decision process. That should be secondary to any of the considerations that you make. And then I'd briefly like to touch on two of the issues that Mr. Williams brought up last time, and that was your perception that possibly the grandfathered and the improperly operating dispensaries are part of the perceptual angst out there in the community, and I think that's spot on. I think you need to reduce the time that these grandfathered units are allowed to continue. I think if Mr. Wiley feels that a lease is a legal liability issue, that's certainly something you can craft into that to show and produce that's a way out to keep going. But the differences between the current operations that were grandfathered and the new ones and then probably the revised ones are so significant that it should be obvious that those are a problem in the community. There also seems to be adequate opportunity for those people to move and get in business at a newly enforced operation. And then, Mr. House, you and I are going to continue to quibble on the enforcement issue on what we're going to call illegal operating dispensaries. You asked Captain Martell a question at the end last session, and you got the answer that you would expect from the police department, and that's that they will go out and investigate. I continue to maintain, and have been not told different, that once they investigate and find an operation that is in compliance with the state guidelines, that becomes a code enforcement operation. We may think that we're going to elevate that code enforcement operation, real close, quicker than we would my boat in the side yard setback or my too tall fence. But I also think you have the burden of removing that process from that type of situation and shutting those things down immediately and not putting them in the same process of reducing my fence height. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Mike. Rosa Chavez, followed by Adela Castellanos. Maybe we don't have lost Rosa. How about Adela Castellanos? Glenn Maurer? You're not Glenn.
Not my dad, but...
I didn't know there was two. You really surprised me there. Time machine.
Well, I am in support of the medical collectives and co-ops in town. There's a few things that need to be addressed, like residential things. It's zoned so that residents can live anywhere they want in the city. And as far as commercial zones or industrial zones, those are more restrictive. So it seems like there's already stuff in place to keep businesses out of residential areas. So that's pretty much a moot subject right there, it seems. And number two, by limiting the number of places that are allowed to dispense or provide marijuana for patients, you falsely create a situation where now it's more expensive to get and therefore it's not as safe. The more money that is associated with the marijuana, the more likely people think that there's going to be crime, which has been proved not to be true. According to the police, there's been dispensaries for almost 10 years or so in this town, and there's hardly been any calls for these places. Number three, both Santa Barbara and the state of California have both voted in a majority, one to allow medical marijuana, and in the city to make it a lowest priority. So if marijuana is supposed to be the lowest priority in town, why all this discussion about how dangerous it is if it's not a high priority? And that's what the residents have voted, that it's not a high priority. So the majority have voted, you know what I mean? You know what I'm saying? Okay. And then the U.S. Supreme Court, as far as banning any of these places like San Diego, Riverside, the U.S. Supreme Court has upheld California's right to have medical marijuana, and they said they will not hear anything from the state in regard to that as being able to shut down these places because the California law stands. So, thank you.
That concludes our public comment. do have a half an hour for discussion. Ask committee members if they first have any questions. Apologize for that. I didn't have my mic on. That concludes our public comment. And we will move on to first questions, any additional questions from the committee members, and then comments from the committee members. I do want to go down this list of subjects one by one, because otherwise this will be utter chaos. First general questions, and then let's go and tackle the subjects one by one. Any questions from members of the committee? So, general questions. One issue I think that's the first one to handle is the amortization period, which is how long the non-conforming dispensaries have to come into conformance with current regulation. We have heard from the city attorney that right now there's about 19 months left to come into conformance. I am a little bit worried about. Basically, my general reason of not supporting a moratorium is I believe that what a moratorium does is puts what we have in place right now. It's a timeout that will entrench whatever the system is that we have right now. And if you like that, if you think that's working, then a moratorium is good. I don't think it's working. I think that there are problems associated with some of the non-conforming, though not all of the non-conforming, and that we need to address that. The city attorney has not recommended us to go past a year. I really hate to see us waiting another year to bring those into conformance. I guess my question would be, could we put that down to 6 months, but have a caveat that if there was a signed lease that was, before the date of this hearing, that they could have a little bit more, so that we would not be liable for their lease amount. So that was a nod from the city attorney. That's a yes. We could cut it down to 6 months, but then allow them the possibility of producing a lease that gives them a little bit longer if it was signed before this date.
Yes.
Okay. What is the committee member's opinion on amortization? Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, that brings up a question, Mr. Wiley. Suppose, just assume hypothetically that we did shorten the amortization period and someone had, let's say, the 5-year lease, as in your example. Do they have, under California law, since they signed a lease in good faith, but then the city's laws changed, do they have some kind of an out?
Yes, and typically I would think they would, because the standard lease, and I've virtually never seen a commercial lease that didn't contain the requirement that the use be legal. So that would sort of be a nullification of the lease, that if the use subsequently became an illegal use under the zoning ordinance, that the tenant couldn't continue, and it might be a defense or as allow the tenant to terminate the lease. And actually, I may have, in a sense, misspoke when I talked about a 5-year lease, because when we developed our ordinance, it was real clear we were talking about a 3-year amortization period. So most of the ones that have been permitted under that ordinance would have had notice that they had to comply within 3 years. So except for the ones that existed prior to the existing ordinance, that shouldn't be the case.
Okay. Well, in that case, I'm okay with a reduction of the amortization period. I don't have a problem with that.
Well, my feeling is this is the possible place for a lot of abuse, not by far, not by all dispensary owners, but definitely these are places that, because of the nature of our ordinance coming into effect after a lot of them existed, are already out of compliance with our spatial requirements and our security requirements in some cases. We have said that you can't be 500 feet from a school or park. Some of these are within that boundary. My feeling is 6 months should be enough for them to come into compliance, find a new place to rent, or and trying to come into the city and shut down their existing operation. Is there a motion on amortization? Mr. House?
I just what I'm trying to grapple with here, and I think a lot of people here are as well. There's a lot of concern, and we're hearing about it from a lot of folks from different angles, that there are of the dispensaries that exist, that there is a direct relationship between the negative influence on young people or